Japan's decision to convert two helicopter-carrying ships into fixed-wing aircraft carriers has generated criticism on two fronts. Military analysts question the military sense of carriers in the age of long-range precision missiles, while other domestic critics decry the move as a flagrant breach of Japan's constitutional constraints on possessing senryoku, war potential, and one likely to provoke Japan's neighbors, most notably China. Against this backdrop of criticism, why did the administration of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe take Japan back into the difficult business of carriers? This article argues that contrary to stated criticism, the carrier conversion program does provide Tokyo with tangible military benefits, but these on their own are insufficient to explain the decision. Instead, we show the move is motivated in part by the desire to leverage carriers' symbolic value for political ends. Japan's decision to upgrade two helicopter-carrying destroyers to launch jet fighters has proved highly controversial. One, because a weapon's usefulness is relational to the presence of the means to blunt, deflect or repel it. Analysts contend that carriers, with their large radar signatures, are vulnerable to long-range missiles. Two, not to mention drones or their increasing susceptibility to submarines, mines and potentially cyberattacks. 2.3 David Richards, the UK's former Chief of Defence Staff, sardonically dismissed his own country's carriers as unaffordable vulnerable metal cans. More particular to the Japanese case, domestic critics have castigated the move as a breach of Japan's avowed constitutional position to never possess senryoku, war potential. 5A led editorial by the Japanese daily Asahi Shimbun called the carrier conversion unacceptable, since it represented a clear break from Japan's strictly defensive post-war security policy. 6. Some of Japan's neighbors have also voiced their ire. Following the conversion program's announcement, China's Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, Hua Chunying, spoke of Beijing's strong dissatisfaction and opposition to the move, urging Japan to adhere to a purely defensive policy. 7. Given that certain naval analysts believe technological developments have made aircraft carriers obsolete, 8. And on top of the backlash against the decision, why did the administration of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe seek to take Japan back into the carrier business? The answer to this question is far from trivial. Anticipating which capabilities are likely to feature in future Japanese military planning will be a major factor in the evolving regional military balance in East Asia. Indeed, the extent to which Asia-Pacific states are responding militarily, or not, to China's rise is a question of crucial significance for 21st-century peace and stability. After his return as prime minister in an unexpected landslide election victory at the end of 2012, Shinzo Abe set out his administration's intention to make Japan a first-tier power again. 10. Keen to demonstrate this goal to Japan's strategic ally, the U.S., he announced to a Washington, D.C. think tank audience that Japan is back. 11. The passage of his administration's landmark security legislation in 2015, which includes breaching the constitutional ban on collective self-defense, has received considerable scholarly treatment. 12. Scholars and analysts, however, are divided over whether Abe's moves were a proportionate response to Japan's emerging security environment. 13. Or revisionist posturing to restore Japan's international status rather than a practical security option. 14. The case of the carrier conversion program provides a further window into this debate. To preview our main conclusion, we argue that possessing carriers, even light carriers, makes a non-trivial contribution to Japan's territorial defense. However, the military rationale is insufficient on its own to explain the decision. Splicing theories associated with the intersubjectivity of certain weapons and empirical evidence from interviews with serving or retired Japanese defense officials, military officers, and national security experts, we instead show how the Abe administration intended to leverage carriers' symbolic status for political ends. To lay out our nuanced explanation of Japan's carrier renaissance, the article proceeds as follows. We first place our argument within the wider theoretical discourse about the symbolic value of weapons and weigh up the extent to which this has historically motivated political actors in their defense program choices. The next section contextualizes the carrier conversion decision within Japan's evolving strategic posture. Following on from this, we analyze the military rationale for light carriers in relation to Japan's emerging threat landscape before moving to discuss the political benefits the government, and especially the former administration of Shinzo Abe, might be feasibly trying to accrue through carriers' enduring symbolic value. The final section, which forms the conclusion, discusses this paper's contribution to the scholarly literature and current understanding of the emerging balance of power in East Asia. Under dominant rationalist interpretations of strategic affairs, governments constantly recalibrate their primary national security tool, the military, to best address their state security environment. 15. Usually, the overriding long-term security consideration is the external threat posed by other states, especially from those deemed to harbor hostile intent. Whether or not states, or, more to the point, those acting on their behalf, ultimately make the wisest choices is unimportant for rationalist theories. The assumption is that they are always trying to. To be sure, states and their leaders may, and often do, make mistakes about the efficacy of certain weapons or doctrines, overestimating the capabilities of certain weapons or capabilities and underestimating the abilities of others to blunt, repel or defeat them. More recently, however, a growing minority of scholars have attacked these presuppositions. For some, key choices about a nation's defense may be subservient to the interests of sub-state actors, most prominently the various services that make up a country's armed forces. 16. The need to appease these constituents may knowingly result in suboptimal decisions regarding defense output. 17. Others take issue with the lack of attention given under rationalist interpretations to normative considerations in defense choices. This second strand of critical scholarship contends that ideas are often more important in explaining political phenomena than rationalist theories admit, even in the realm of national security decision-making. 18. In the nuclear proliferation literature, this perspective is most often associated with what Scott Sagan has called the norms model, which emphasizes the symbolic rather than the military value of nuclear weapons, in this case. 19 in particular. The norms model argues that states are driven to acquire certain weapons because they represent a significant symbol of state modernity and identity. Possessors will receive recognition commensurate with the respect that such symbolic weapons command. 20. The empirical record for the importance of leveraging the symbolism of high-profile weapons as a motivating factor seems compelling. Mao Zedong, founder of the People's Republic of China, stated that his country built its bomb in part for international status. 21. In a similar vein, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein was interested in weapons of mass destruction for their capability to deter or wage war, but also for their benefits for his prestige among the Arab states. 22. Away from WMDs, the symbolic value attached to high-status conventional weapons helps explain why all sides in World War II, but especially the Axis powers, invested so heavily in large battleships. Such majestic dinosaurs 23 were thought of as sacred vessels. Their size and guns had come to be considered representations of national power. The idea that states often forego their direct interests for the sake of prestige, that is, backing projects that demonstrate modernity, engaging in conflicts over status, or building weapons that are grand but impractical, has a longer lineage in IR scholarship than is usually recognized. Indeed, in the 1940s and 1950s, Hans Morgenthau and other realists emphasized the importance of prestige. 25 Prestige or related concepts like status and reputation, which can all be thought of as the expected products of possessing symbolic weapons, has increasingly gained traction as a missing element in current theories of international politics. When discussing leaders' anticipated benefits accrued from possessing a symbolic weapon, whether this is prestige or the signaling of some message to an intended audience, it is important to separate the tangible from intangible. A benefit of symbolic weapons, such as prestige, status, or reassurance to allies, is not literally a commodity. It involves not just what one has done in material terms but how others interpret why one does it, and a set of expectations about how each other is likely to interpret the act. In this way, intended politically useful byproducts of these weapons are derived from more than simply the military power produced by the artifact but also their symbolic value. There is a good case to be made that this behavior, the attempt to accrue non-material benefits by building a visible and imposing weapon, explains why some countries adopt aircraft carriers. The current Aircraft Carrier Club has members who possess only one or two carriers, and these vessels appear to address no real security concern. 27 In the extreme case of Thailand, its single carrier is not even kept on operational status. In the sections below, we evaluate the extent to which the carrier conversion decision was in part taken for intangible, non-material motives. Japan's conversion program provides a useful case for testing the relative strengths of military rationalism versus the so-called norms model, because we can largely discount the third possibility, that the decision was taken to appease a powerful domestic constituent, the Maritime Self-Defense Force, MSDF. The civil-military power balance is such in Japan that the various services within the self-defense forces have only a marginal influence over key defense decisions. 28 Before turning to the main analytical sections, we provide a brief overview of the carrier conversion decision in the context of Japan's evolving defense posture. In 2013, Japan's MSDF launched the JS Izumo helicopter carrier and its sister ship, the JS Kaga, 2 years later. Designed to carry an air wing of a maximum of 14 helicopters and ostensibly built for anti-submarine warfare, the two 27,000-ton, full-load, Izumo-class multi-purpose destroyers, 22DDH, were acquired as command and control ships that could also be used in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, HADR, missions. 29 After conversion, JS Izumo, and later JS Kaga, will be able to operate a variant of one of the world's most advanced fighter aircraft, the F-35Bs, an American short takeoff and vertical landing, STOVL, or jump jet, AV-8B Harrier. Although the ships will be able to carry only a dozen or so of these aircraft apiece, and thus they are best thought of as pocket, or light carriers, the announcement marks a step change in Japan's post-1945 naval development, giving the MSDF a capability it has not possessed since the Second World War, the ability to launch fixed-wing aircraft from flat-top ships. In isolation, the decision is laden with much significance. Domestic critics and some neighbors view this move as evidence that Japan is shifting to a more assertive or even offensive posture. Article 9 of Japan's 1947 constitution, which rejects the use of force to settle international disputes, forbids the country from possessing senryoku, war potential. 31 Rearmament in the post-war period was justified in terms of the need to have the wherewithal for territorial defense and no more. Indeed, the Self-Defense Forces, SDF, were created, as their name makes clear, with an exclusively defensive mission, Senshu Boi, with no specific types of weapons or capabilities explicitly prohibited by the constitution. However, successive Japanese governments have been left to decide what was appropriate for self-defense. Debates seeking to clarify the difference between forces built for self-defense and those with senryoku have regularly occurred in the Diet, Japan's parliament. 32 Prohibitions against possessing senryoku. For example, the long-standing restriction against the MSDF having Senkan battleships became more problematic during the Cold War as Japan's maritime interests required a naval presence well beyond its shores. 33 To cut a path through these constraints, the Japanese government interpretation of Article 9 has always been loose. Japanese lawmakers and constitutional experts, not to mention IR scholars 35, have long disagreed over the criteria for designating a weapon as offensive. Assessments about what constitutes an offensive land weapon have typically used the combination of mobility and firepower, which, when put together, can be termed striking power. 36 But attempts to apply such principles to naval warfare fall down on the differences between land and sea. Navies by their nature are mobile, and much of the sea on which they travel are global commons rather than sovereign territory. Although Alfred T. Mahan observed that he navy, by its mobility, is preeminently fitted for offensive war, navies can engage in a range of aggressive and passive operations. 37 As one naval analyst notes about carriers more specifically, they can be moved around the globe like queens on a chessboard, responding to disasters, minor aggressions, and showing the flag either in threat or in support. The Japanese government has a record of employing semantic cover to weapons that could be perceived to have offensive characteristics. 39 Following this practice, Japanese government officials have made vigorous attempts to show how the converted ships will be used for defensive purposes and thus do not breach the Constitution. 40 Critics employing Thomas Skelling's point that even weapons proclaimed to be defensive often embody equipment or technology that is superbly useful in attack and invasion. 41 Claim that carriers possess war-making potential regardless of stated intentions. In the Japanese public's imagination, there is little subtlety when it comes to carriers. They are simply offensive weapons and, for detractors, the clearest illustration yet that Abe and his successors are determined to move the SDF's role away from one of purely Senshu Boei. The modified Izumo ship will obviously be an aircraft carrier in violation of the Constitution, as long as it can launch fighter jets to attack opponents, states one leading academic critic. 42 As such, domestic opposition to the carriers should be viewed in the context of ongoing debates about Japan's recent national security changes. From a significant loosening of a decades-old ban on arms exports to a landmark decision allowing for the limited exercise of collective self-defense, former Prime Minister Abe's contentious policies in defense and security remain a source of intense debate within the country, with the carrier conversion being foremost among them. 43 The carrier conversion decision represents the latest in a series of major revisions to Japan's national security posture that were pushed under Abe's second administration and have continued under his successors and protégé, Prime Ministers Yoshihide Suga and Fumio Kishida. While sensitivities over Japan's pacifism have declined in recent years, it is still a powerful force in domestic politics. 44 The carrier decision also runs counter to Japan's long-standing policy of avoiding displays of military strength that might provoke a reaction in neighbors. Indeed, for much of the post-war era, Japan has pursued a policy of military self-restraint aimed at reassuring its neighbors that its intentions remain limited when it comes to the use of force. 45 Why then did the Abe administration press ahead with the refitting of the Izumo at Yokohama shipyards at the risk of provoking hostility at home and abroad? 46 Do the carriers make a significant enough contribution to Japan's national defense to justify the program on these grounds? From a realist standpoint, one which carries more of a normative prescription than realists often care to admit, military policy, and more narrowly the acquisition of weapon systems, should be a state's rational efforts to best defend and enhance national interests. This, in turn, should be based on available resources and in response to external stimuli, i.e., the threat posed by others. Does Japan's acquisition of a light carrier capability meet this standard? Is there still a valid military rationale for a regional navy such as Japan's to move into the carrier business? There is a case to be made that the possession of carriers, even light carriers 47, are a boost for regional navies, especially if they provide an asymmetric advantage over foes. 48 Indeed, Japanese defense officials defending the conversion program emphasize its tangible contribution to Japan's defense, furnished with the formidable F-35B, and similar in many ways to USS America and her sister ship Tripoli. 49 The Izumo carriers will provide Japan with a movable air defense system. It is not difficult to imagine a range of defense scenarios in which Japan would benefit from such organic fighter cover. Light carriers could prove useful in a conflict involving disputed small islands, as the deployment of the U.S. Navy's USS Wasp on an exercise in the South China Sea appears to foreshadow. 51 Japan's smaller islands to the south, most importantly the Senkakus, claimed by both China and Japan, cannot support airfields, and thus the Izumo could patrol these waters, offering organic air cover. These islands are far from any major SDF base and, despite increases to the Air Self-Defense Forces, ASDF, presence in Okinawa, are difficult to protect from Chinese actions. At any rate, a major move by China on the Senkaku Islands would almost certainly be preceded by an attempt to neutralize the ASDF Okinawa base, leaving the islands exposed. ASDF aircraft on the more distant Japanese islands of Kyushu and Honshu could provide defensive air cover only with the help of aerial tankers. In such a scenario, which Japanese defense planners fear greatly, a carrier would close the distance between Japan's air bases and its vulnerable territory. See Figure 1.53. As one defense analyst has concluded, from this perspective, the carrier makes sense, since it enlarges Japan's defensive range and provides it with some level of resiliency. 54 For Japan, they could deter aggression against the disputed islands in Japan's southwest island chain. Being on the spot, Japanese forces can also better respond to a range of naval contingencies, blocking Chinese paramilitary forces or some other state-directed adventurers before they occupy one or some of the islands under a spurious pretext, a la Argentina's 1982 occupation of South Georgia in the South Atlantic, which sparked the Falklands War. In short, having a carrier in the region would provide a powerful deterrent. The JS Izumo, for example, could offer highly symbolic as well as real military backing to Japan's well-equipped Coast Guard. Deterring adversaries, confronting regional threats. The balance of power in Northeast Asia is shifting with startling speed. Japan now finds itself facing potential adversaries with growing capabilities. 57 added to North Korea's testing of ballistic missiles, which have become more aggressive in recent years. Japanese planners are increasingly occupied with Chinese actions. 58 This change in threat perception has led to an incremental but significant shift in defense planning. 59 And renewed questions about the viability of Japan's deterrent strategy in the absence of an ability to strike back. 60 The grand strategic bargain, that the US will provide the military capability to strike offensively from Japanese bases while Japan's military will maintain the capability to defend its home islands, remains under some doubt. 61 Indeed, Japan's conversion decision chimes with Abe's push for greater self-reliance, Jijo Seishin, in defense and Tokyo's cognizance that the US may not risk war with China over small, uninhabited islands. 62 According to Sheila Smith, as American political leaders openly debate their commitment to Allied defenses, Japanese politicians are beginning to argue for greater military capability, including limited strike capability, to ensure potential adversaries do not miscalculate SDF readiness. 63 But while Japan's ability to independently strike back may be enhanced by its carrier conversion, this program may be a less than optimal option when it comes to best defending its national interests based on available resources. For a maritime nation such as Japan, a carrier is one means of developing a retaliatory capability. However, in the context of the expanding A2AD net of potential adversaries, carriers, of any size, seem an increasingly poor investment for offensive operations. It is more likely Japan would choose to develop a longer-range missile capability if it is determined to acquire an offensive strike capability for deterrence. This deterrence could be established by the threat of punishment or by a preemptive attack against an adversary's impending ballistic missile launch. If not contributing to Japan's ability for preemptive or retaliatory strike capabilities, the refitted Izumo and its sister ship could potentially conduct carrier warfare operations outside of Japan's territorial waters. 64 Light carriers, in fact, might be appropriate in scale for protecting vital convoys traversing the vastness of the Pacific against sporadic air and submarine attacks using their onboard fighters and helicopters respectively. 65 Operating in the vast western Pacific, the light carrier with its maximum complement of F-35Bs, on paper, packs serious combat capability. 66 The Japanese MOD, however, has stressed that the Izumo will operate the F-35B only when necessary and will continue to operate mostly helicopters. 67 Indeed, accommodating F-35Bs entails trade-offs in space onboard the ships, compromising their ability to perform other tasks. 68 Moreover, the MSDF lacks appropriate accompanying screening and logistical ships necessary for such operations. To use aircraft carriers in an offensive capacity requires they form up around their own battle group, which is hindered in Japan's case by the possession of diesel subs that can only patrol close to home waters rather than picket the carrier. 69 Indeed, few states have ever had a large enough carrier force to implement independent carrier warfare. 70 There are additional obstacles for Japan adopting carrier warfare. It will take time to efficaciously operate the ships as fixed-wing carriers even within the relatively benign conditions of its own waters, let alone in the open seas. As Michael Horowitz writes, operating a floating airfield and the ship itself, plus coordinating with support ships, is simply a much harder set of tasks than lining up the big guns of a battleship and firing. 71 Few states in history have adopted the core organizational practices associated with learning how to launch and recover airplanes from mobile airfields. 72 Carrier battle group operations are especially tricky, presenting the complex systems integration challenge of coordinating air assets and accounting for logistical ships. It can only be mastered after a lengthy period of constant training and experience. 73 The task is made more difficult in Japan's case by the fact that whilst the MSDF will operate the ships, the ASDF will be responsible for the F-35Bs. The significance of this division of labor should not be understated, as one former MSDF officer noted. Yes, the F-35Bs will likely be hosted on the MSDF commanded carrier but piloted by ASDF pilots. The air wing will be ASDF, the commander of the vessel will be MSDF. This is the only option available as the MSDF has very little money and no trained personnel to pilot the planes. The ASDF has more funding and experienced pilots who know how to operate F-35As. They can more easily be trained to operate the F-35Bs. The ASDF and MSDF cooperation and joint operations is tentative, necessary and potentially revolutionary. However, a joint operation structure with joint staff started about 10 years ago, so this concept is not entirely new. 74 Because of infrastructure support demands, limitations of the F-35Bs, tacit knowledge requirements, and the daunting systems integration challenges, it is unlikely that Japan will be able to adopt independent carrier warfare in the near term. 75 Despite the potential detractions listed above, it is practicable for Japan to acquire light carriers for potential use in hostilities beyond its own waters when operating alongside the U.S. Navy. For one thing, it would avoid Japan needing to form up an independent battle group. An Izumo-class carrier could deploy in tandem with an equivalent U.S. small flattop, such as USS Wasp. The ability of the Izumo-class conversions to operate the F-35B is also militarily significant to the U.S., which currently only has a few flat tops operating the F-35B. If the JS Izumo and JS Kaga are added to this, the number of vessels carrying the aircraft quickly multiplies. In aggregate, they could produce more organic air power than the sum of their parts. 761 Former MSDF flag officer explains how this might work in practice. He converted Izumo would be used in concert with the USS Wasp. They are both amphibious assault ships with naval and marine contingents as well as, in the case of the Izumo, ASDF pilots and planes. If only one ship with 10 planes was sailing, it can only field 5 planes offensively and 5 planes remain for defense. However, if 2 ships of the same class sail together, 5 planes can play defense while 15 planes can play offense. Acquisitions that are interoperable with U.S. forces make sense for Tokyo. Japan's military planners believe sustaining U.S. military dominance is the best hope for Japan's security in the face of a militarily powerful and bellicose China. As such, they believe Japan should develop capabilities that complement U.S. military power in the region. 78 Beyond cooperation with U.S. forces, the carriers could be used to further interoperability with other partners, above and beyond that already taking place in various countries under the guise of maritime security and Coast Guard training. 79 This includes Japan's quadrilateral security dialogue, the Quad, partners of India, Australia and the US, but also, critically, partners like the Royal Thai Air Force and perhaps the Vietnamese. 80 In practical terms, it is currently almost impossible to train with these partners in Japan given various sensitivities about noise or military posture. As one former member of headquarters, U.S. Forces Japan noted, "Everything in Japan is very close together. The Americans have been experiencing this problem for years. Frankly, given the current situation, it would be an enormous political challenge for Tokyo to invite another country's military for large-scale training together with the SDF on Japanese soil. And sending fighter craft abroad to train with neighboring countries' air forces, for example, also presents challenges. As such, carriers may provide a way to build longer-term and more practically useful military relationships with their Japan's partners further afield while avoiding some